Okay. So I'm not going to have as much to say about this one. This one's a little more all over the place. In a lot of ways, it's kind of following up on the things that were covered in the previous episode. And we see a lot of the things from the previous episode come to fruition. I'd say broadly what this episode is about is the 50s. And
Yes.
underpinning it is it's about the particular kind of Freudian. If you watch like Hollywood films around that time, you get just through cultural osmosis the kind of like Freudianism that was in the air and maybe even a part of, generalized planning in the United States. But it starts out talking about kind of the trauma of the English speaking world coming to terms with the Holocaust and what happened with the Nazis. And I think the base of the problem seems to be that what went wrong with the Nazis was this release of irrationality, and that these monstrous, they kind of accepted Freud's narrative to a certain extent that these monstrous forces inside of people were allowed to run wild, and that caused the Holocaust, as opposed to, the Nazis being like a political party or a political group that, unleashed these kind of like latent reactionary things that existed, in the particularity of Germany in history, right?
But importantly, we're talking about a bottom up. Like, there are these horrible, awful things that are all there in people all the time. And all that happened is that this emergent irrationality was sort of allowed to express itself through the German Nazi project. It wasn't as much of a social critique of the Nazis specifically. It had, and I think there's wisdom to universalizing this a little bit. It had implications for all humans. But interestingly, and I think this is true culturally, right? It wasn't really about the atomic bomb or what, the Allies had to do to win the war. It was specifically about the phenomenon of the Holocaust, specifically about the Nazi state.
Right. And this is basically the bourgeoisie wants to make sure that the dog stays on the leash in the United States.
Yeah.
Which is, again, that's like a bourgeois way of thinking about it, as opposed to seeing the Nazis politically. But anyway, so it opens, Adam Curtis is kind of describing the situation. This is a great mirror shot of like the suburbs in this, I think, concave mirror, like on the front of a car or whatever. And he's talking about, they thought there were all these like latent fucked up desires just underneath everything. Although I will say that does kind of exist in the suburbs. There is like this weird, almost like balkanized like psychosis that has been built up like in American like middle class society now. So
yeah, I think that's there in the episode, like that like especially when by the time they get to Marcusa, that the society that we're being asked to adapt to has a sickness.
Yes. So anyway, they also commissioned a number of studies where they were looking into the soldiers and trying to understand like why they were breaking down. They brought in these Freudians who explained that the harsh circumstances of the war brought up a lot of repressed like childhood trauma and other issues that they brought with them to the battlefield, and that's why you had all these soldiers being sent back from the front because they completely lost their shit.
And again, like a half truth, not entirely false, but politically blinkered.
Right. So it leaves off on that, and it's kind of interesting watching the sort of earnest interview with that one guy or whatever.
Yeah, that was hard.
It does show, there's something kind of innocent about it. Like you do feel like sometimes when you're watching this that you're seeing people from like another world. No, people like this like don't seem to exist as much anymore. But anyway, so we transition from there to Anna Freud. And Anna Freud was not necessarily the originator of ego psychology, but she was the main like advocate for it and kind of the institution, basically at the bully pulpit within the institution of psychoanalysis. And it's clear that
in Curtis's metaphor, Anna Freud is sort of the pro-democratic managerial representative, right? Like you had something a little darker with advertising. You had something much darker with the Nazis doing a political project that is anti-democratic. And this was supposed to be some kind of pro-democratic managerialism, right?
Right. And it's also Freudianism adapting to the imperatives of like Anglican rationalism, right? Like you have this thing that's kind of continental in origin that's brought over into
Right.
the English speaking world. And so, yeah, we're going to adapt the elements of it kind of in the same way that Bernays adapted it to capitalism. And another guy later in this episode will do the same. Curtis tells a story of this heiress who came to Anna Freud and basically offered up her kids as test subjects, more or less. And then Anna Freud attempted to use these theories to mold them, and in one case, like Freud the gay away.
Yeah. I thought that was a pretty good like shorthand for the critique that this was making overall. And although it doesn't really go into the Freudian rationale for why this stuff, why being gay is bad and the political aspects of, there was a psychoanalytic theory of fascism as like an expression of homosexual desires, you know what I mean? Like, which, that's all kind of bracket knowledge. That's fun to know when watching this, but it's not directly articulated here.
Right. So, and then those kids go on to become basically trad people in America. So, mission accomplished for now.
Good job.
Yeah. I will say though, so ego psychology, part of the reason actually, and one of the major figures of 20th century psychoanalysis who never shows up in this series is Lacan. And I feel like it's worth mentioning that Lacan, one of his big things was that he was very strongly against the ego school of psychoanalysis. He basically he very strongly, again, being a continental guy, objects to this idea that there's some kind of external reality that we can refer to. And he objects to this idea that strengthening the ego is like a worthwhile goal in any sense. Because that's what they wanted to do. They basically wanted the ego to be this ideal regulator of your drives and your relationship to the world around you.
Right. Although I really associate regulator with the superego in the Freudian terminology, right? Like the self and the sort of now kind of thing. But I don't know. Maybe I'm losing some nuances. It's just maybe that's one of the things about ego psychology and the way it tends to play out, is it's maybe less about that, like the unbounded self, and a little more about like, constricting the psychic butthole, as you were, if you will.
So Truman signs what's called the National Mental Health Act, which is influenced by the research that was done with the soldiers. And the Mentninger brothers are guys who are basically tasked with training a lot of analysts in order to make up for this lack of people capable of doing that work in the United States, and with soldiers specifically. And so this is kind of makes the idea that what was key was to change one's ability to be adaptable to the external things that are going around the world, and just basically change yourself to change the world. And what this kind of shows, and what this will set up, I think, for the next episode, is how, for the boomers who were born in this period, this idea was foundational to the world that they existed and were raised in. Right? Like all this crazy like guru shit that they're going to get to in later in the 20th century. Like that was already there, but in this like early, more rational, clinical form.
Yeah, rationalistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the foundations were already laid for this authoritarian kind of relationship through a figure that has, greater insight into the human soul, many reincarnations above you in terms of knowledge. I think it's interesting that these figures are often from, the continent. They represent a sort of, Marxists tend to think of continental philosophy as true proletarian, insight. But in a way, for America, it's almost like a representatives of a lost, like, aristocratic tradition. That's never explicitly stated, but I feel like that's there. And that, they're interjecting this, humanist wisdom. And if there is anything like really perceptive about Freudianism, its ability to transmit like the cumulative humanities into some generalizations about human behavior, you know, and power psychology and that sort of thing. I don't think I realized how foundational Freudianism was to the 1950s, you know, era of good feelings. And, you know, it's a part of the country's history that I think gets as close to like fascism as America tends to get, you know, in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And I don't think I appreciated just how integral that was. And it makes a lot of the feminist engagement with Freud, it motivates it, the radical feminist stuff, in a way that I don't think I appreciated before.
Well, a couple things too. When I said earlier, because you said about them being this kind of lost aristocracy, I got that sense too, especially with some of these interviews you just see in the film. And that's kind of what I also meant by like a lot like people like that don't exist anymore. Because like someone like these European older psychoanalysts, like there's this one where he's like, you know, talking about like all the successes they got, and he's like, and it gave us a swell head, you know, and like I don't know, I almost felt like it was adorable. I almost felt like Homer Simpson seeing Hans Moleman. I just wanted to kiss him on the top of the head, like.
See, I thought you were talking about the soldiers and like the purity of their kind of like.
Well, that a little bit too, but I was thinking,
like the one is an African American soldier breaking down and being kind of like apologizing for breaking down and talking about how much his sweetheart means to him and how much he relied on her to get through. Like the unspoken. Well, what the narration says there is that the trauma was not from battle, but it was from childhood, which is what gives lie to the half-truth, right? How could the trauma not be from battle? Like, yes, there are things that come out from childhood, but World War II was like a cavalcade of horrors. How could that not have triggered this?
Right. I mean, yeah, it was the era of industrial warfare. You know, you're put into like this giant machine, and that's just, you know, yeah, I don't understand how that doesn't completely like damage people in a variety of factors, independent of like, yeah, maybe it weakens their ego or whatever, and brings up their childhood trauma, but that's not the core issue.
There's a poem about World War I and II that talks about the trauma of industrial warfare from World War I, and that the saddest thing is that they would have to do it again.
The other thing I was going to respond to was about Freudianism being so foundational. I think there probably was a little bit of a split too, because this was also the era of probably the highest level of religiosity in the history of the United States ever. Like you had, I think the amount of people who were going, this is the birth of kind of the Christian right, but also there was this kind of vague, this is before it really became split, but there was this kind of vague religiosity that you even see echoes on. And again, if you watch The Simpsons, you know, they're Methodists, they go to church, right? And that was this like stock standard aspect of American civic life at the time. But that was also profoundly influential and wouldn't necessarily fit into this purely rationalistic context. I suspect the Freudian thing was probably more foundational, probably in more metropolitan areas and stuff like that. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that might dovetail with the leveraging of anti-communism that comes in later.
Yeah. So the movie then hops to the Institute for Motivational Research, that was run by a guy named Ernest Dichter. This guy is basically Bernays 2.0. Did you ever watch The Wire?
I watched a few episodes.
Okay.
Not enough to talk intelligently about it.
I was gonna say, so in season 4, there gets to be like a new gangster who's like the new young blood gangster who's taken everything to the next level and doesn't give a fuck about any of the previous accepted like mores from before.
Oh, so you know, hey, no families, no kids, you know, like
yeah.
So
that's not exactly, but that some of that's just the way it's framed because he's actually very similar to the other people. But that's the sense you get. Like, oh, this guy, I know these other guys because they've been around 3 seasons, but this guy's dangerous. But Dichter is like next level in that sense, you know, because he takes all of this and because there was something, I don't know, there was something of a huckster about Bernays. You know, he's very like 20s old world or not like 20s old school capitalist out to make a buck. You know, he's the traveling
salesman.
he's the traveling salesman. Yeah, but this guy is like actually doing like precision, like almost like anthropological research methods in order,
Right.
and using a Freudian framework in order to even more effectively appeal to people's unconscious instincts in order to sell them in order to sell them things better. And it's situated within a Cold War context, in that he believed that essentially capitalist hedonism would help win things out for the West and prevent, it would, in a more rationalistic way, would prevent another sort of something like Nazism or the triumph of Bolshevism or whatever. And
Right.
in a fucked up sense, he was kind of right. It was kind of effective.
Yeah.
You know, like there's the old joke about when after the wall fell and when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, it became clear that the desires that they had was less maybe for like a better civic life and like democracy, and more they wanted like Nintendos and pornography and machines, you know, and like the lure of that shit was like a major appeal, you know, and even in like the upper ruling classes of the socialist bureaucracy, a big reason that they kind of sold the country out from under them was because they were convinced they could get a better deal if they were a capitalist and integrated with the West, because they saw how their elites were doing on the other side of the wall, you know.
Right.
But anyway,
So we want to talk about some Betty Crocker cake mix.
Yes. So apparently the reason you add an egg to cake mix is entirely arbitrary, and it was because women felt like they were cheating they weren't putting themselves into the product, and so the eggs, I guess, symbolize like the woman's eggs or something.
Yeah. It's purely scientific. The woman is offering her fertility to her husband. Yeah, by cracking an egg and beating it and putting it in there. It leverages some kind of fertility symbol to make the woman feel like cake mix isn't cheating. That was the group therapy session about products. That's the cash value of what Dichter got out of that, which apparently it had a big impact on the sales, adding an egg. So, defying economic rationality, having it be slightly more resource intensive, slightly more labor intensive, made it more attractive.
He also basically invents the research group, and you can see a germ of what's to come later in that you also, through this sort of thing, discover that people just love talking about themselves.
Fancy that.
Yeah, and that can be integrated into consumerism in a big way too. Okay, so we check back in on Anna Freud and what's probably her girlfriend's kids. Their lives are starting to fall apart. It's not going well. So, double down on another realm of Anna Freud psychoanalysis to stitch things up. And
Bob and Abby are getting swept under the rug. They're experiencing breakdowns. And I don't know what happened to the other Birmingham children, but obviously they're not as interesting.
So at this point, the show again checks in on Bernays, who is full on doing CIA shit and is instrumental in the Guatemalan coup, involving because due to their plans to expropriate lands from the United Fruit Company. One of the most infamous of CIA coups of the 20th century, and there have been many. Bernays basically decides there's some irrational fear about Americans' concerns about nuclear war and the Soviet Union. So let's just stoke that shit and try and harness the blaze, and
which is not what you would think immediately. Like, you would think, oh no, people are afraid of nuclear war because the Soviets developed their first hydrogen bomb in 1953. We should quell their fears. We should try to make them not afraid of nuclear war. It's kind of it's kind of a next level move to be like, actually, let's encourage this fear in a fanatical anti-communist direction in order to control it, in order to mitigate it.
Yeah, so he creates like a fake, some sort of firm or whatever he's putting out these press missives about how
the Middle American Information Bureau.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Kuomintang government is becoming increasingly Bolshevized. Look at all these books they have with Stalin's name on the front of them.
Right. And
And
according to Curtis, they're just, democratic socialists, basically uh, Chile, 1973.
Allende.
Yeah, an early Allende kind of moment.
Well, Allende sounds militant next to this guy, probably because he had that example before him.
Yeah, and it's a similar issue. 1953, they wanted to nationalize the land of the United Fruit Company that was doing business in Guatemala and owned a significant amount of their of the land to do banana plantations. Apparently, this is where the term "banana republic" comes from, which I know from a department store. And yeah, good to know. Good to know that's a really racist, colonialist, imperialist term.
Yeah, and you see, it's really gross. Like you see them basically gin up all this stuff about. They literally have this press conference with Richard Nixon out there lying his ass off about how look at
Doing
all these
what he
books,
loves.
look at all these books they have that are communist books that were around the office. Clearly this was going in a bad direction. And it's funny too, like because like the stuff Richard Nixon got for lying about is so minor in comparison to all the shit that was going on at a much deeper level, like this, anything. It almost makes me sympathetic to the conspiracies that Watergate was a setup on him.
Yeah. I mean, just, listening to Kissinger's advice about continuing the Vietnam War for twice as long for election reasons alone.
Yeah.
Is sickening. But also, yeah, I didn't know that he was involved in this. I wasn't sure that was Nixon because, I don't think it was explicitly stated, and frumpy white guys look alike. But
it was Nixon.
It looked a lot like Nixon. So I'm willing to believe that.
5 o'clock Shadow Nixon. I got it up right now.
Yeah, and I think that was after the coup, right? And they're look at all this literature we found. See, what a commie. But it turns out Alberns had no links to Moscow. But who cares? Like Bernays was like, this is brilliant. We have a communist threat close to our shores. We can spin this.
Yeah, and he couldn't even bother to shave to go legitimize the government that we could. Unreal.
Yeah, come on.
So from there, we go into MK Ultra.
Well, before we get to MK Ultra, I know you're going to be excited to talk about MK Ultra, but after the CIA coup in Guatemala in 1954, Howard Hunt, who's involved with the CIA, was he a director? I forget. It said on the screen, but my notes are great. Howard Hunt says essentially what we wanted was a terror campaign, and compared what the CIA wanted to do to, like, I think Nazi terrorism, essentially, to demoralize the population of Guatemala, which is
that clip. Jesus Christ,
that's an incredibly insightful statement about what's going on, and I wonder what that clarity means to him. Did he feel that was justified as he was saying it? Because it seems like the kind of thing that indicts itself.
Yeah, he's literally saying it on camera.
Was this like a regretful interview afterwards, or was he like, oh yeah, we were just pulling from the Luftwaffe playbook, like
I have no idea, because it's not like it was like he had like a Adam Curtis had like a sombrero on with a camera hidden like in the top part poking out, like it was lit. Right. The camera was there. He had a mic on. Like there's so much. Part of the reason, the only thing that keeps me from getting like too deep into conspiracy countries, there's so much shit that's just like out in the open, Yeah.
No. He seemed pretty. I don't know. Was it comfort? It was very forthright. He was very like confident about saying it. He wasn't it was kind of like this. He was like, no. This is what we were doing.
He's just a soulless operator. I mean, that's it.
How do you live with yourself? knowing that you're doing that. Like yeah. Anyway.
Well, that brings us to the next subject, MK Ultra, and
Yeah.
the powers of mind control that the CIA attempted to develop.
Damn it.
Um,
One more thing. That after the clip about Howard Hunt comparing the CIA to Nazis, we get bananas from source to shortcake. Like, and it brings it all back to like selling people the products that are, you know, derived from imperialism. Like,
yeah, the literal fruits of empire.
it's a pretty masterful stroke on Curtis's part as an essayist, and really brings the terror, you know, really links the terror on the periphery to the plenty of the core and the like insipid lifestyle of the core. Like it really, yeah, it shows you the link like very clearly in a way that like, I don't know. We spend a lot of our time trying not to think about, because if you think about it all the time, it drives you fucking nuts, and you're one of those people.
So actually, I've been trying to jump to MK Ultra more to move the episode along than to that I have a lot to say about it. The only thing I would take issue with his, because he does talk to somebody who claims that her memories are basically wiped out by this program. Basically, within MK Ultra, the CIA came to believe that it was possible to do literal mind control, and they say they believed, whether they did or not, the Soviet Union was capable of working on doing something similar. It's possible because we all, you know, had the same. They were all pulling from the same pool of Nazi scientists that they kidnapped. Right. So, you know, maybe there is some truth to that. But
I mean, I'm sure they thought they could do it. Like it fits into the structuralist kind of like way of thinking, where oh yeah, tabula rasa, just fucking, you know, wipe the slate clean and, you know, just fill it with Stalin.
Well, and in this period too, the CIA, like LSD had recently been discovered. Nobody really knew how it worked or what it was capable of. So a lot of MK Ultra was them experimenting with LSD, both on unwitting subjects and on each other. Apparently they used to like microdose at office parties.
Oh man. Yeah. Fast forward, you know, 60 years later to Silicon Valley. Anyway.
Yeah. So Curtis claims that little actually came from it because their conception of the mind was flawed, and which is probably true, but I think it's possible that more came from this than, I mean, because on some level, I think that's what they want us to believe, man. Like, because if they were able to do some crazy shit, they wouldn't want people knowing about it. You know, this is a problem with the existence of this. It's like it's a black box. There's all this stuff where you don't know what's in the fucking box.
Yeah, we might learn like, you know, 60 years down the road. Well, yeah. I guess it is 60 years down the road, isn't it? We should know.
Now, I guess not enough of them are dead yet. I don't know. So from there, we detour into Marilyn Monroe.
Right.
This is, and apparently, I don't know how much I really want to get into this. You know, it's for the purposes of this film, especially being about the 50s era psychoanalysis, it's kind of the perfect thing you want to put in there to showcase the limitations of it, and that they weren't able to help her address, you know, whatever her issues were.
Yeah. The main point here is that there was a high profile failure of psychoanalysis, something really like that shook people before a wave of critique. So Ralph Greenson, you know, is, you know, top in the biz, psychoanalysis, became Marilyn Monroe's analyst, you know, introduced her to like a family treatment so basically like treated her like his daughter more or less, and like incorporated her into, you know, a family structure. And one of apparently his other patients was like, well, you never did this with me. And he's kind of like, yes, but you have no idea how, you know, how little she has of family structure.
Well, it's also like you weren't that messed up.
Right. Well, but that's the same thing for them. You know, having family structure is, and this is a deep conservative conviction to this day, constantly leveraged against single mother households or gay households or, you know, poly households or whatever. Right. Like you can't have a healthy family without, you know, the natural and the spanker, you know.
Well, you have to have the father there to break the bond of the mother and child. Otherwise,
Right.
you turn into Norman Bates.
Yeah. And you gotta institute the incest taboo.
But this basically lays the groundwork for the counteroffensive against psychoanalysis. So they bring in Arthur Miller, talking about how, it's at least a particular form of psychoanalysis that took hold in the United States in this period was a part of this process of denying like strife or pain or anything like that, and that's where most of like the deepest insights that people come from. This is where Herbert Marcuse starts to step in and points things around and says, this is, again, continental tradition pulling from like even Freudianism, saying, no, it's a sick society. That's the problem.
Yeah. And this is where Curtis's voice is probably heard the loudest, like, in terms of how he's editing it. The interview with Arthur Miller, it's like, listen, you can't cure trauma. You have to let suffering inform freedom. That kind of goes as an indictment of this whole thing. There's a book that's published called The Hidden Persuaders that just lays out the critique that Curtis is drawing from to a degree. And then Herbert Marcuse does have, some thoughts in common with this kind of like psychoanalytical fear of fascism. But, this empty prosperity that is presented in this culture will erupt into that kind of violence. Like, you can't just repress this in the way that they want you to. The society that you're adapting to is sick.
Right.
Inner emotional drives aren't evil. Repressing these drives causes the evil. It's the society really that has the sickness. It's not the individual sickness simply aggregates into the Holocaust. Like, that's not it.
And what's kind of cool, and I think they actually bring in MLK at the end, who offers maybe the best take we've gotten this entire time. And it kind of goes to show why so many look to him as a moral leader, because he basically lays it out. Look, obviously, I'm madly paraphrasing here, of course. Obviously, you want to work on your issues. You don't want to be just a wreck. You don't want to be schizophrenic. But if you exist in an unjust society, a certain level of maladjustment in your personality is both moral and good for you, right? Like,
and he's proud. He's proud to be maladjusted to racial discrimination, segregation, to religious bigotry, and to economic inequality when there's just plenty all around.
Right. And this maybe is the first kind of outline at the limits of focusing on the self, beyond all, of course, like the Doomer stuff and him, portraying these people as Icarus, more or less, and constantly exceeding their reach is constantly exceeding their grasp. Like the point that he's kind of making is, yes, like people should work on themselves to a certain extent, but if you exist in a society that is fundamentally unjust and contains exploitation and all of these horrors, like if you are perfectly adjusted for that, you're actually kind of fucked up. And you want to maintain a certain level of unease and maladjustment, because if everybody just adapts to these things, like that's morally horrific. And somebody is going to be maladjusted no matter what, because they have to eat all the shit. They have to take all of the labor and all the problems of the society on, and be the ones doing the labor of fixing those things or managing those things.
Yeah, plugging the hole as it, there are the ravages all around you, and you're kind of like, I don't know, you're pouring dirt into like a sinkhole to try to like plug it.
Yeah.
There's no way that can't cause some pain, some friction, and it defies a hedonist ethic where pain is bad, pleasure is good. If you have higher notions of the good, if you have like a sense of justice or whatever, like you just can't avoid pain all the time.
Well, and if everybody gets turned into like these happiness machines, as Herbert Hoover called them, that's acid on the fabric of society. Because if everybody is just these individual like pleasure maximizing robots, like there's no base, like it doesn't matter that somebody else is getting exploited. It doesn't matter that you're creating these massive tensions with society, because those are all externalities. That's all external to you, and that's not sustainable.
Yeah, I think what King says is actually a good compass for where we want to kind of go with our overall project here, because you don't want to be like a raging ball of like mental illness that can't do anything. Like nobody wants to be. But like, how can you be okay in a society so sick, right?
Yeah.
I sometimes think of this as, being an agent from the future and having to blend in with a society that, you feel is barbaric, right? Like, because you can't make everything line up with your communist ethics overnight, but like, you have to like internally at the very least dignify some of your pain and some of your discomfort with the society, and certainly King is externalizing it too in a way that is like profoundly constructive, in a way that I think very few of us have ever even touched a notion. It's just a little drop of how constructive that kind of externalization can be. Obviously, if you're ever a lib in the United States, and even if you're conservative, like, you have a tremendous respect for how this guy brought these things to the forefront. Like, and so it's just a question of, how do you deal with this dis-ease? How do you deal with this like sense that something is wrong without losing your goddamn mind?
Yeah. Well, and there's this thing on the culture of I think that emerges somewhat on the culture of the internet where, everybody is the smirking Wojak where it's a mask and he's like angry and crying behind it. Like everybody.
I'm not mad. You're mad.
I'm not mad. You're mad. I'm cool. Everything else is lame but me, the arbiter of cool. And some of that is just the fucked up incentive structure of you have to be. Why shouldn't we follow you if you don't have the good takes? But part of that is just. I think what's good about, because King comes out of the Christian tradition, and what's one of the great like moral innovations of the Christian tradition is the body of Christ being this realm of repentance and integration for people who sin and fail, and the left doesn't really have anything like that. That's why things like degenerate into like these ritual circular firing squads.
Yeah, we have hell but not heaven.
Right. There isn't really any clear like path to redemption for anybody. And yes, of course, in Christianity that can become gamified or whatever. And that there was that famous televangelist who was just like, I've sinned or whatever. Or even George Bush, who was like, I can write off all the blow and going AWOL and this and that and pressuring some lady into abortion because, hey, I repented of my sins and I stopped drinking. But even so, having something like that is kind of socially necessary in order to have things not just descend into endless mutual recriminations. And what's also, and that's tied to King's insight here, where, I'm proud to be maladjusted these things. So if I seem mad or if I seem triggered, or if you're just replying to what I say with the gif of that one like pussy hat lady like screaming when Trump was elected, like it's like, you know what? It's not the worst thing in the world to be fucked up about something that's fucked up. And on some level, like, I mean, nobody wants to seem triggered. Nobody wants to seem not cool or like a weirdo. But I think that some of that is a little, again, it's inevitable and not something that we should seek to completely repress in order to do some fucked up like Alinskyite social integration.
Yeah. I mean, there's a virtuous form of being able to integrate all of the negatives and still kind of maintain your composure. That is the essence of cool. I'm at peace with the things that are not good here, but that's not going to affect how I present myself, how I, maintain my level-headedness every day. And that can quickly slide into this vicious form that is, it's just a shadow of what it's supposed to be. It's not integration. It is integration, or excuse me, it is repression that is masquerading as integration. It's someone being like, yeah, I can acknowledge that. I'm cool. I'm fine with that. Like, but it's just, those are just words. Like, if there's a deep way in which this should be traumatic, you should not be fine with it. And it should be genuinely hard to reconcile the kind of things that you have to put forward to be a confident individual in this society when these things are so deeply wrong. And in a way, a lot of us just have to participate in them. And I say a lot of us, we all have to participate in them. And, you know, accumulating some level of guilt or bad conscience or whatever it is almost inevitable for having intercourse with this, you know, awful way of life every day. It chips away at the person that we all want to be if we have, especially a communist ethic or something approaching, you know, King's Christian ethic. Like, regardless of, you know, what form that takes, it chips away at that every day. And so it shouldn't be so easy to integrate. That's a life's work. And I think Marcuse is good about this too, is that it's not just a community that this destroys, it's the self. The self ends up this bag of the false positivity that erupts into violence. And that is absolutely where a lot of like fascist urges can come from. I mean, I guess at least fascists have the, you know, the 2 minutes hate or whatever. But American liberalism had it too. Or, you know, American conservative liberalism, whatever. The post-war consensus had that communist 2 minutes hate to let it out.
Well, they're still beating up on Russia.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, strangely now, yeah, it's more of a liberal thing to do. But yeah, it's still there. That stuff is still there. And it's just that the right is more focused on the enemy within.
Well, yeah, I mean, and for the right, it's a little more China too. Like they take, you know, China inherited the mantle of the communist flag or whatever, so it's them. Anyway,
yeah.
So the episode ends with the deaths of the kids that Anna Freud was looking after. I think the daughter, I guess she basically kills herself at the Freud Institute.
Yeah, at Freud's old house, in the Freud house. You know, you can't get more symbolic than that.
Yeah. And the episode ends with Curtis basically saying in a very cheery tone, and it's with very bouncy music underneath. The next episode will document the rise of the enemies of the Freud family and how they sought to counteract all of this through the liberation of the self. And you get the sense from his tone that that's not going to work either.
Right.
And the episode then ends with a montage of what I can only assume are my online enemies who are mad after I own them so bad, epically online.
Yeah. The primal scream therapy and such.
Yeah. And so that's that episode. And I think that's good. I'm gonna hit end broadcast here.
Yeah, sounds good. Hey, Grimlock, thanks for coming.